Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku was bitten by a radioactive spider before Peter Parker. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The air in Aldera Junior High's classroom 3B tasted of chalk dust, adolescent apathy, and the dying embers of 1,000 forgotten dreams. For Izuku Midoriya, it was the taste of his everyday reality. He sat hunched over his desk, the wood scarred with the history of past students, trying to make himself as small as possible. A human period at the end of a sentence no one wanted to read. All right, you third years, it's time to start thinking seriously about your futures. The teacher slapped a stack of career aptitude pamphlets onto his lectern with a resounding thwack that made Izuku jump. I would hand these out, but... He swept the papers off the desk, sending them fluttering into the air like a flock of startled paper birds. I know you all pretty much want to be heroes, the classroom erupted. A cacophony of cheers and the popping, snapping, and glowing of 24 burgeoning quirks filled the room. One student elongated his fingers into woody tendrils. Another shot small sparks from her palms. A third hardened his skin into a dull, rocky gray. It was a chaotic symphony of potential, and Izuku was the only one in the room without an instrument. He meekly raised a hand, a gesture of participation he knew was futile. He wanted to be a hero, too. More than anyone. Yes, you've all got some impressive quirks. The teacher placated, his smile thin and practiced. But you know the rules. No using your powers in school. Hey, teach! A voice boomed, slicing through the din with the casual arrogance of a king addressing his court. Don't lump me in with these losers. Katsuki Bakugo sat with his feet propped on his desk, a lazy, contemptuous smirk plastered on his face. He leaned back in his chair, the picture of insolent confidence. I'm the real deal. The rest of these rejects will be lucky to end up as sidekicks to some D-lister. The class turned on him, a wave of indignant shouts rising. Get over yourself, Bakugo. You think you're better than us? Let's go. I'll take you all on. Bakugo retorted, slamming his feet to the floor. The teacher consulted his clipboard, a flicker of genuine interest in his eyes. Ah, Bakugo. You, of course, are aiming for UA High, aren't you? A hush fell over the room, replaced by impressed, disbelieving whispers. UA? The national school? Their acceptance rate is, like, less than 1%. He aced the mock exams, so maybe. Bakugo's smirk widened into a predatory grin. That's exactly why it's the only place worthy of me, he declared, leaping onto his desk in a single, fluid motion. I'm gonna surpass even All Might and become the #1 hero. Not to mention the richest. Izuku sank even lower in his seat, the heat of second-hand embarrassment, and a familiar, soul-crushing envy warring in his chest. Kaken is amazing, he thought, a well-worn track in his mind. His quirk is perfect, he's got the grades, the confidence. He was born to be a hero. Oh, that's right, the teacher said, his eyes scanning the list again, his voice taking on a tone of mild, clinical curiosity. Midoriya. You're aiming for UA as well, aren't you? The silence that followed was absolute. It was a dense, heavy silence, thick with judgment. Then it shattered. The entire class erupted into laughter, a cruel, unified roar that crashed over Izuku like a physical wave. It was louder and more mocking than it had been for Bakugo's boasting. Midoriya? No way, you can't get into the hero course just by studying. He's quirkless. What can he even do? Izuku flinched with every word, each one a tiny, sharp stone striking his already bruised spirit. He shot up from his seat, his hands clenched into fists. That's not true. They got rid of that rule. I could be the first one. Bam! An explosion, small but concussive, sent him stumbling backward. He landed hard in his seat, his ears ringing. Bakugo stood over him, smoke wafting from his palm, his red eyes narrowed into slits of pure malice. Listen up, Deku! He snarled, the nickname, a twisted version of Izuku's name that meant useless, dripping with venom. You're even worse than these rejects. You're quirkless. A pebble on the side of the road. You think you can stand in the same ring as me? Izuku couldn't meet his gaze. He stared at the floor, his face burning with shame. And no, Kaken, I wasn't. I wouldn't dream of competing with you. It's been my dream since I was little, and, well, there's no harm in trying, right? No harm in trying? Bakugo's voice dropped to a low, dangerous growl. He snatched the notebook from Izuku's desk. Izuku's heart leaped into his throat. Hero Analysis for the Future, number 13. Bakugo read aloud, his lip curling in disgust. He flipped through the pages, filled with Izuku's meticulous drawings, detailed quirk analyses, and strategic breakdowns of pro-hero fights. Still doing this creepy stalker stuff, huh? Give it back! It's mine! Izuku cried, reaching for it. Bakugo simply held it between his palms. With a sharp crackle and a flash of light, he blew the notebook to smithereens, the cover charring and the pages within turning to blackened ash. He then casually tossed the smoldering remains out the open window. Izuku stared, speechless. His breath hitched, a silent sob catching in his throat. All those hours. All that work. You know, Bakugo said, placing a heavy, warm hand on Izuku's shoulder, the faint smell of nitroglycerin stinging his nostrils. If you want a quirk so bad, there's a quick way to do it. Just take a swan dive off the roof and pray you'll be born with one in your next life. He walked away, his cronies snickering behind him. The teacher, who had watched the entire exchange, simply cleared his throat and resumed his lecture. The incident was over. For everyone but Izuku, the school bell was a mercy, releasing him from his prison. He walked numbly to the back of the school, where his notebook had landed in the koi pond. The fish, bright splashes of orange and white, nibbled at the singed edges of his hard work. He fished it out, the waterlogged pages pulpy and ruined, the ink bleeding into meaningless gray streaks. Stupid Kaken, he thought, tears finally welling in his eyes. You can't just tell someone to kill themselves. What if I actually did it? He clutched the soggy book to his chest and began the long, lonely walk home, the weight of his quirkless reality pressing down on him, heavier than ever. His dream felt not just distant, but impossible. A childish fantasy he was long overdue in letting go. As he trudged past the main school office, the crackle of the PA system echoed in the empty hall. Attention, please! Will the following students please report to the principal's office immediately? A crisp, administrative voice announced. Several names were called, students known for their academic prowess. Izuku barely registered them. Then, the last name hit him like a physical blow. And Izuku Midoriya, his blood ran cold. What did I do? Is it about Kaken? Did someone report him? No, they wouldn't. I'm in trouble. I'm always the one who gets in trouble. He shuffled towards the office, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Inside, Principal Aoki sat behind his large desk, flanked by 3 other students, 2 boys and a girl Izuku vaguely recognized from advanced placement classes. They looked just as confused as he felt. Ah, Midoriya! Come in, the principal said, gesturing to an empty chair. He was a portly man whose ferrokinesis quirk was famously only strong enough to levitate paper clips, which he did constantly out of nervous habit. A small constellation of them orbited his head now. Izuku sat, clutching his ruined notebook. Now I'm sure you're all wondering why you're here. Principal Aoki began, steepling his fingers. As you know, Aldera Junior High prides itself on academic excellence. To that end, for the past several years, we have participated in a highly prestigious international science and culture exchange program. He paused for dramatic effect. The other students leaned forward, intrigued. Izuku just felt a growing sense of dread. This couldn't possibly involve him. This year, the principal continued, a proud smile spreading across his face. Our school, in partnership with several top institutions in the United States, is sending a small delegation of our best and brightest to New York City for 1 week. A collective gasp went through the other 3 students. New York! The home of countless pre-quirk-era heroes from the comic books, a global hub of finance and technology. The trip will include cultural tours, visits to a partner school in Queens, and most excitingly, an exclusive, guided tour of the primary research and development facility of Oscorp Industries. Izuku's head snapped up. Oscorp? The American tech giant? Their work in cross-species genetics and bioengineering was legendary. Izuku had read dozens of papers on their theoretical applications for quirk therapy and artificial limb development. His mind, for the first time all day, began to race with genuine excitement, pushing aside the gloom. The selection was based purely on academic merit, standardized test scores, and teacher recommendations in the STEM fields. The principal explained. You four represent the top percentile of this entire school. Congratulations. You've earned it. Izuku stared at him, unblinking. It didn't make sense. He was Deku. Useless. Quirkless. The butt of every joke. But his grades were undeniable. He studied with a desperate, ferocious intensity, as if good test scores could somehow compensate for his genetic deficiency. He'd never imagined it would lead to something like this. A form was slid in front of him. A permission slip. His eyes scanned the words, New York City. John F. Kennedy International Airport. Oscorp Industries Tour. It was real, a tiny, fragile spark of hope, one he thought Bakugo had extinguished for good, flickered to life in the deepest part of his chest. It was a chance to see something new, to be somewhere no one knew he was quirkless. To be somewhere he wasn't Deku. For the next 2 weeks, Izuku lived in a daze of surreal anticipation. He threw himself into research, not just on Oscorp, but on New York itself. He studied maps of Manhattan, practiced rudimentary English phrases, and filled a brand new notebook, number 14, with questions he wanted to ask the Oscorp scientists. The flight itself was a marvel. As the plane descended, the sprawling metropolis of New York City unfurled beneath him like a circuit board of impossible complexity. The skyscrapers were steel and glass titans, piercing the clouds in a way the buildings in Japan, designed to withstand quake-related quirks, never did. The energy of the city was a palpable hum that vibrated through the soles of his shoes as they exited the airport. It was loud, chaotic, and utterly intoxicating. The trip was a whirlwind of new experiences. He saw the Statue of Liberty, a silent, green guardian watching over the harbor. He stood in the neon-drenched chaos of Times Square, craning his neck back until it ached, feeling like an ant in a world of giants. He ate a slice of pizza so large he had to fold it in half, the cheese stretching in a way that seemed to defy physics. Throughout it all, he remained a ghost to his classmates. They traveled in a tight-knit clique, their conversations a mix of Japanese and halting English, leaving him to trail behind, an observer lost in his own world. He didn't mind. It gave him more time to sketch, to analyze, to absorb everything. During a joint session at their partner school, Midtown High, he noticed a boy with messy brown hair and an old, beat-up camera slung around his neck. The boy, Peter Parker, was quiet like him, but possessed a startlingly sharp intellect. When a teacher posed a complex question about quantum mechanics, it was Peter who answered, his explanation both elegant and profound, leaving the teacher momentarily speechless. Izuku made a mental note. A brilliant mind. Finally, the day of the Oscorp tour arrived. Izuku could barely contain his excitement. He wore his nicest clothes and had his notebook and a half-dozen sharpened pencils ready. The Oscorp Tower was a monument of sleek, dark glass that seemed to drink the sunlight. Inside, the lobby was a cathedral of corporate power, with a soaring atrium and a massive, stylized logo of a spider woven into the marble floor. Their tour guide was a woman named Dr. Evans, a geneticist with a sharp smile and a passion for her work that Izuku found infectious. "Welcome to Oscorp," she said, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Here, we are not just pushing the boundaries of science, we are rewriting the very code of life itself. Our goal is to unlock humanity's full potential, to eradicate disease, and to repair what is broken." She led them through gleaming white hallways, past labs where scientists in clean suits worked with an intense, silent focus. Izuku's head was on a constant swivel, his pen flying across the page of his notebook as he tried to capture everything. He saw schematics for advanced prosthetics that could integrate seamlessly with the human nervous system. He saw demonstrations of biocables with a tensile strength rivaling steel. He was in heaven. The tour's highlight was the genetics division, the heart of Oscorp's most revolutionary and controversial research. "As you all know," Dr. Evans explained, gesturing to a series of large, sealed terrariums, The emergence of quarks 80 years ago was the single greatest leap in human evolution, but it was an unpredictable, random leap. What we are trying to do here is understand the mechanics of that leap. By studying species that have evolved unique, superpowered traits, we can map the genetic pathways to those abilities. Inside the terrariums were some of the most unique creatures Izuku had ever seen. A gecko that could alter the color and texture of its skin to perfectly mimic any surface it touched. An eel that could generate a targeted, high-voltage electromagnetic pulse. A frog whose skin secreted a powerful, fast-acting healing agent. And then, he saw the spiders. Our most promising project is the Arachnid Genomics Program, Dr. Evans said, her voice tinged with pride. We have created 15 genetically distinct species of spider, each one bioengineered to amplify one of its natural abilities to a near-supernatural degree. She pointed to one. This one, for example, can produce a web with the proportionate strength of a suspension bridge cable. She moved to another. And this one possesses a form of precognitive sensory input, a danger sense, if you will, that allows it to react to threats fractions of a second before they occur. Izuku was scribbling furiously, his mind ablaze with possibilities. This is it. This is the key. If they can isolate the genes for these traits, they could create serums, gene therapies. They could give people powers. They could give me. He stopped that train of thought before it could fully form. It was a dangerous, forbidden fantasy. The group moved towards the final exhibit in the lab. Izuku, however, was captivated by a single, empty terrarium at the end of the row. The placard beneath it read, Specimen 42, Bio-coded Cross-Species Transference Vector. What about this one? Izuku asked, his voice barely a whisper. Dr. Evans glanced back, surprised he had noticed. Number 42. Our little prodigy. That one was an attempt to synthesize the most desirable traits from all the other specimens into a single organism. Enhanced strength, speed, adhesion, the danger sense, the works. A true super spider. Where is it? Another student asked, peering into the empty glass box. A flicker of annoyance crossed Dr. Evans's face. That's a good question. Dr. Connor's team was handling its transfer this morning. It should be in its new containment unit. She tapped her tablet. Probably just a clerical error, but Izuku, with his analyst's eye, noticed something she didn't. A faint, almost invisible strand of webbing leading from the top corner of the terrarium to a ventilation duct in the ceiling. His eyes followed the path. It escaped. The thought was a jolt, but he quickly dismissed it. This was Oscorp. Their security would be airtight. The spider was probably already found and secured. As the tour moved on, Izuku lagged behind for a moment. On a nearby workstation, a scientist had left up a detailed schematic on their monitor, a molecular diagram of the adhesive protein in the spider's web. It was elegant, complex, and beautiful. Izuku, a slave to his analytical instincts, quickly opened his notebook and began to sketch it, his mind completely absorbed in the intricate lattice of molecules. He had to have it. He was so engrossed that he didn't notice the small, silent creature descending from the ceiling on a single, silken thread. It was no bigger than his thumbnail, its body a dark, inky blue marked with a startlingly vivid, almost glowing red hourglass pattern on its back. It swung gently in the air current, a pendulum of fate, before landing soundlessly on the top of his open, yellow backpack. It crawled inside, finding a dark, warm space amongst his textbooks and souvenirs, and became still. Izuku finished his sketch, a triumphant grin on his face. He pocketed his notebook and hurried to catch up with the group, completely oblivious to the stowaway he had just acquired. The bus ride back to the hotel was abuzz with chatter about the tour. Izuku sat by himself near the back, eagerly transcribing his messy sketches into cleaner, more detailed diagrams in his notebook. He reached into his backpack to grab a different colored pen, his hand rummaging through the contents. That's when he felt it. A sharp, stinging pain on the back of his hand, like a hot needle being jabbed into his skin. Ouch! He yelped, pulling his hand out. He saw a small, dead spider on the floor of the bus, its legs curled up. He must have crushed it when it bit him. On the back of his hand, 2 tiny puncture marks were surrounded by an angry red welt that was already beginning to swell. He felt a pang of guilt for killing it, whatever it was. He looked closer at the dead arachnid. It had a strange, vibrant pattern on its back, red and blue. Just like Specimen 42. The thought was absurd. An escaped, multi-million-dollar bioengineered super spider biting a random, quirkless kid from Japan on a tour bus? It was the plot of a pre-Quirk comic book. Far more likely it was just a common house spider that had found its way into his bag. The bite hurt, but that was it. He rubbed the spot, dismissed the paranoid thought, and went back to his notes, the incident all but forgotten. The flight back to Japan was a long, overnight ordeal. Hours into the journey, high over the Pacific Ocean, Izuku began to feel unwell. It started as a headache, a dull throb behind his eyes. Then came the chills, a deep, bone-rattling cold that no thin airplane blanket could ward off. He began to sweat, his forehead slick with a feverish sheen. His chaperone, a tired-looking teacher named Mr. Takeda, noticed his discomfort. "Midoriya-kun, are you all right? You look pale." "I am fine," Izuku managed to stammer, his teeth chattering. "Just a little cold." But it wasn't just a cold. It was a violent, full-body assault. Every muscle in his body began to ache, then spasm, as if his limbs were being twisted and pulled in every direction. The bite on his hand was on fire, a throbbing, searing epicenter of pain that seemed to radiate up his arm. He closed his eyes, hoping to sleep it off, but his mind descended into a feverish, hallucinatory nightmare. He saw flashes of images, intricate, geometric webs stretching into infinity, the world fracturing into 1,000 pieces, like a fly's compound eye, the face of Dr. Evans, her smile warped and monstrous. His senses went into overdrive. The gentle hum of the airplane engine became a deafening roar. He could hear the whispered conversations of passengers from 10 rows away. The light from a reading lamp a few seats over felt as bright as the sun, searing his retinas. His body felt alien, as if his very DNA was being unspooled and rewoven into a new, terrifying pattern. He felt phantom limbs, an extra set of arms and legs twitching at his sides. He heard a clicking, chittering sound that seemed to be coming from inside his own head. He convulsed in his seat, a strangled gasp escaping his lips. Mr. Takeda and a flight attendant rushed to his side, their faces a blur of concern. They spoke to him, but their words were a garbled mess. All he knew was pain, confusion, and a profound primal terror. His body was being remade, and the process was excruciating. His last conscious thought was one of bitter disappointment. His dream trip, his one chance to be someone else, had ended like this. Sick, pathetic, and helpless, he surrendered to the darkness, his body going limp as he passed out completely. Silence, warmth, the familiar scent of his mother's fabric softener. Izuku's eyes fluttered open. He wasn't on the plane. He was in his own bed, in his own room. Sunlight streamed through his window, illuminating the legion of All Might posters that covered his walls. The hero's signature, unchanging smile seemed to watch over him. He sat up. The fever was gone. The chills, the muscle spasms, the sensory overload, all of it had vanished. In fact, he felt incredible. Better than he had ever felt in his entire life. A deep, resonant strength hummed in his muscles. His mind felt sharp, clear, and focused. He took a deep breath, his lungs filling with air more fully than he could ever remember. He looked around the room. The details were so crisp. He could see the individual fibers in his all-might-themed blanket, the faint texture of the paint on the wall across the room. He blinked. Something was wrong. Or rather, something was right. Too right. He reached up and realized his glasses weren't on his face. He never took them off until he was fully in bed. He must have been so out of it that his mom had done it for him. But he could see perfectly. Better than perfectly. A wave of disorientation washed over him. He felt groggy, as if waking from a long, deep sleep. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, planting his feet on the floor. He needed to get up, to understand what had happened. He reached out, placing his right hand flat against the wall beside his bed to steady himself. Thump. The sound was soft, almost organic. A strange sensation, like a faint suction, radiated from his palm. He pushed himself up, but as he tried to pull his hand away, it didn't move. It was stuck. He stared at it, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. His hand was pressed flat against the drywall, and it would not come off. He pulled again, harder this time. There was resistance, a strange, powerful adhesion connecting his skin to the painted surface. He tugged with a jolt of rising panic. With a sound like tearing Velcro, his hand peeled away from the wall. A small, thin layer of paint and paper came with it, stuck fast to his palm. Izuku Midoriya, the boy who was defined by his lack, by what he didn't have, stared at his hand. He then looked at the small patch of damage on his bedroom wall, and in the silent, sunlit room, a new, impossible, and terrifying reality began to dawn. He was still quirkless. But he was no longer powerless. For a long, silent moment, Izuku Midoriya did nothing but stare. His world had shrunk to the space of 3 objects: his own trembling hand, the small, ugly patch of peeled paint stuck to his palm like a bizarre skin graft, and the corresponding white scar of exposed drywall on his bedroom wall. The morning sunlight, once a cheerful promise of a new day, now felt like an interrogation lamp, pinning him in place. His mind, a well-oiled machine of analysis and overthinking, was sputtering, failing to compute the input. He flexed his fingers. The paint flakes crinkled. It was real. It's not possible, was the first coherent thought that managed to break through the static. This is a dream. A side effect of the fever. He needed to disprove it. He needed to prove to himself that the laws of physics and biology, laws that had so cruelly defined his entire existence, were still in effect. With a deep, steadying breath, he turned to the undamaged section of the wall beside the new blemish. He slowly, deliberately, pressed the same palm flat against its surface. He felt it again. A faint, almost imperceptible tingle that danced across his skin, followed by a low hum of energy he felt more than heard. It was like the static charge from rubbing a balloon on your hair, but 1,000 times more focused, more potent. It was a feeling of connection. He held his hand there for a second, then tried to pull it away. It stuck. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through him. He yanked his hand back with a gasp, and once again, the sound of tearing paper filled the quiet room. A second, larger patch of paint was now adhered to his skin. He stared at his wall, which now looked like it had a bad case of acne, and then back at his traitorous hand. No, 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 he whispered, his voice hoarse. He frantically rubbed his hands together, trying to dislodge the paint, but it was stuck fast. He scrambled to his bathroom, turned on the tap, and began scrubbing his palm with soap and hot water until his skin was raw. The paint finally sloughed off in soggy clumps, swirling down the drain like evidence being disposed of. He leaned over the sink, breathing heavily, and looked at his reflection in the mirror. He saw the same familiar face, wide, green eyes filled with a perpetual look of anxious wonder, a spray of freckles across his cheeks, and an unruly mop of dark green hair that defied gravity. It was the face of Deku, the quirkless kid. But the reflection felt like a lie. Something fundamental had changed behind those eyes. His scientific curiosity, a force of nature as powerful as any quirk, began to wrestle with his fear. He needed data. He needed to understand the parameters of this condition. Back in his room, he began a series of clandestine experiments. He touched his wooden desk. Stuck. He placed his fingers on the glass of his window. Stuck. He pressed his thumb against the metal leg of his chair. Stuck. It worked on everything. Wood, glass, metal, plastic. It wasn't a simple stickiness like glue. It was a controlled adhesion that he seemed to command with a subconscious thought. He found that if he concentrated, he could turn it off, releasing his hand without any effort or damage. The control was clumsy, like trying to write with his non-dominant hand, but it was there. A knock on his bedroom door made him jump so violently he nearly hit the ceiling. Izuku? Are you awake, sweetie? Breakfast is ready. It was his mom. Why, yeah. I'm awake. I'll be right out. He called out, his voice cracking. He glanced at his doorknob, a new source of potential terror. He reached for it, concentrating as hard as he could. Be gentle. Be normal. Be gentle. Be normal. He turned the knob. It felt flimsy. Spongy, like it was made of clay. He heard a faint groaning sound from within the mechanism. He froze, his heart pounding. Carefully, he released his grip and pulled the door open without using the knob at all. He had to remember. He was different now. Everything was different. He walked into the kitchen, a minefield of mundane objects that could betray him at any moment. He picked up his chopsticks with the delicacy of a bomb disposal expert. He gripped his rice bowl so lightly he was afraid he would drop it. Inko Midoriya watched him with concern etched on her kind face. "Are you feeling better, Izuku? You were so sick on the flight. Mr. Takeda said you were completely delirious." "I was so worried." "I'm fine, Mom." "Really," he said, forcing a smile that felt brittle and fake. "I think I just had a bad case of jet lag. I slept it all off. I feel great." That was the truth, but it was a truth he couldn't share. He felt fantastic. A current of restless energy was thrumming just beneath his skin. He felt like he could run a marathon or lift the refrigerator. The thought was so absurd it was almost funny. He shoveled rice into his mouth, avoiding her worried gaze. Every question she asked, every ounce of her maternal love, felt like a spotlight on the enormous, terrifying secret he was now harboring. This was the first of 1,000 lies he would have to tell her. The weight of it settled in his stomach, heavy and indigestible. School was an exercise in supreme self-control. Every step he took felt spring-loaded, every motion imbued with a dangerous new power. He walked with his hands clenched into fists in his pockets, terrified he might accidentally brush against someone and stick to them. He wrote his notes, with a featherlight touch, paranoid he would shatter his pencil or punch a hole through his desk. The true test, as always, came in the form of Katsuki Bakugo. During the lunch break, Izuku was trying to make himself invisible in his usual corner of the classroom, feverishly scribbling in a new notebook. He wasn't analyzing heroes this time. He was analyzing himself. Subject, personal power analysis. He'd written on the first page, the title a desperate attempt to frame his condition in scientific, manageable terms. He decided against calling it a quirk. The doctor's words from all those years ago were seared into his memory. The X-ray of his foot, the single joint in his pinky toe, the final, clinical diagnosis. "Sorry, kid. It's not going to happen." That diagnosis was a scientific fact. Whatever this was, it was something else. Something unnatural. He drew a diagram of a human hand, with tiny, crackling lines of energy radiating from the fingertips. Hypothesis 1: bioadhesion. Some form of microscopic CD or cilia, controllable at a neural level? Unlikely, as it works through shoes and clothing. Hypothesis 2: localized gravitational or electrostatic manipulation. Seems more plausible. The source must be the spider bite from Oscorp. Specimen 42. Cross-species transference vector. Did it transfer something to me? Still writing in that creepy notebook, huh, Deku? Izuku flinched, snapping the book shut. Bakugo loomed over him, flanked by his usual sycophants. "I thought I taught you a lesson about that garbage," Bakugo snarled, reaching for the notebook. "And no, please, Kaken, don't," Izuku pleaded, clutching it to his chest. Bakugo scoffed. "What's the matter? Got some more useless hero fantasies in there?" He made a grab for it. Izuku, acting on pure instinct, twisted away, pulling the notebook out of his reach. Enraged by the defiance, Bakugo threw a lazy, contemptuous right hook, not an explosion, just a physical punch meant to humiliate and put him in his place. And then, the world slowed down. It was a sensation Izuku had never experienced before. Bakugo's fist, usually a terrifying blur of motion, seemed to crawl through the air. Izuku could see the individual creases on his knuckles, the tightening of the tendons in his wrist, the smug, cruel twist of his lips. Time stretched like taffy, every microsecond expanding into an eternity. Without thinking, without even making a conscious decision, his body moved. He didn't just duck. He swayed backward from the waist, his spine bending at an impossible angle. Bakugo's fist whistled past his nose, the displaced air ruffling his hair. Izuku's body then snapped back to its original position with the fluid grace of a dancer. The entire exchange took less than a second. Silence descended upon their corner of the classroom. Bakugo stood frozen, his fist still extended where Izuku's face should have been. His eyes were wide with disbelief. His cronies stared, their jaws slack. Izuku was the most shocked of all. His heart was a hummingbird trapped in his ribcage. How did I do that? I didn't even, my body just moved. Bakugo slowly lowered his arm, his expression shifting from shock to a dark, simmering rage. What the hell was that? He demanded, his voice a low growl. I don't know. Izuku stammered, which was the absolute truth. I slipped. You didn't slip, Bakugo spat, jabbing a finger in his face. You dodged me. Don't lie to me, Deku. You've been holding out, haven't you? You have a quirk. A pathetic, useless dodging quirk. The accusation hung in the air, more dangerous than any punch. In their world, to hide a quirk was a bizarre and profound act of social treason. No! I swear, Kaken! I'm quirkless. You know I am. Izuku insisted, his voice rising in panic. He could feel the eyes of the other students on them, their curiosity piqued. Bakugo stared at him, his red eyes searching for any sign of deception. He saw only the same pathetic, teary-eyed terror he always saw in Deku. The confusion warred with his ingrained belief in Izuku's worthlessness. It was impossible. Deku was a pebble. Pebbles didn't dodge. He must have just gotten lucky. Bakugo grunted, turning away in disgust. Whatever. A fluke. Don't think for a second that anything has changed. You're still beneath me. You're nothing. He stalked off, leaving Izuku trembling, his back pressed against the cold wall. Nothing had changed? Everything had changed. He had a secret that could get him killed, and a power he couldn't begin to comprehend. He spent the rest of the day in a fog of anxiety, retreating to his new notebook every chance he got. He added a new section, Enhanced Agility/Reflexes. Note: subject exhibits hyperreflexive motor responses to perceived threats. Time appears to subjectively slow down, allowing for complex evasive maneuvers that should be physically impossible. This is not precognition. The threat must be initiated first. It feels more like an accelerated processing speed. My brain sees the punch, calculates the trajectory, and commands my body to move, all in a span of nanoseconds. The level of muscular control required is astronomical. Follow-up strength test required. That evening, he waited until he heard his mother's gentle snores from down the hall. The house was dark and silent. This was his only chance to truly test his limits. He started in his room, doing a simple push-up. He lowered himself, and then pushed up. The motion was effortless. He did another. And another. He did 50 push-ups without breaking a sweat or feeling the slightest strain in his arms. He felt like he could do 1,000. He moved to his desk chair and gripped the metal leg. Be gentle, he reminded himself. He squeezed, slowly increasing the pressure. First, the metal groaned in protest. Then, with a sickening crunch, the hollow tube began to deform in his hand, collapsing inward as if it were made of aluminum foil. He let go instantly, staring at the damage. The chair now listed to one side crippled, superhuman strength. Confirmed. He jotted it down in his notebook, his hand shaking. Strength level, indeterminate, but significant. Must be incredibly careful. Accidental property damage is one thing, but accidentally hurting someone. He couldn't finish the thought. The final test was the one that scared him the most. He had stuck to the wall with his hands. But could he? He took off his socks and shoes, standing barefoot on his bedroom floor. He looked at the wall, then up at the ceiling. It seemed miles away. Taking a deep breath, he placed one foot flat against the wall, just above the baseboard. He concentrated, willing that same strange energy to manifest. He felt the connection take hold. He slowly shifted his weight onto that foot. It held. He placed his other foot higher up the wall. It also held. Then a hand. Then the other. He was horizontal, his body parallel to the floor, clinging to the wall like an insect. His heart hammered against his ribs. He was defying gravity. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to climb. Hand over foot, foot over hand. The movements were awkward, clumsy, but he was doing it. He reached the corner where the wall met the ceiling. This was the true test. He swung his body around, his feet finding purchase on the ceiling's textured surface, and then he was standing upside down. On his ceiling, the world had flipped. His bed, his desk, his all-might posters, everything was hanging from the floor above him. A wave of vertigo washed over him, and for a terrifying second, he thought he would lose his grip and plummet. He squeezed his eyes shut, his hands and feet clamped to the ceiling with desperate force. When he opened them again, the vertigo had passed, replaced by a sense of profound, breathtaking wonder. He was in his room, the most familiar place in his world, but he was seeing it from a perspective no human was ever meant to have. It was alien and beautiful. A small, giddy laugh escaped his lips. For the first time since the bite, pure, unadulterated joy eclipsed his fear. He was quirkless, yes. But he could stand on the ceiling. His moment of triumph was shattered by a sudden, piercing sensation. It wasn't a sound. It was a feeling, a high-frequency buzz that erupted at the base of his skull, drilling directly into his brainstem. It was agonizing. A wave of nausea rolled through him, and the edges of his vision blurred. He gritted his teeth, a cry of pain catching in his throat. It felt like 1,000 dentist drills vibrating in his head all at once. He scrambled down the wall, his graceful ascent replaced by a panicked, clumsy descent. He landed in a heap on his floor, clutching his head as the buzzing intensified. What was happening? Was it a seizure? A brain aneurysm? Was this the price of his new powers, his body breaking down under the strain? The buzzing seemed to be focused on something outside his window. It was a directional pain, pulling his attention towards the street below. He crawled to the window, his head throbbing with every heartbeat, and peered outside. The street was dark and empty, cast in the orange glow of the streetlights. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then, a speeding car, its headlights off, rocketed around the corner. It was going far too fast for a residential street. At the same moment, a cat darted out from between two parked cars, right into the vehicle's path. The car screeched, the driver finally seeing the animal. The sound of tortured rubber filled the air. Just as the car's brakes locked, the buzzing in Izuku's head stopped. Abruptly. The sudden silence was as jarring as the noise had been. He was left with a splitting headache and a lingering sense of dread. The car had swerved, missing the cat by inches before speeding off into the night. He slumped against the wall, his body slick with a cold sweat. He had known the car was coming. No, that wasn't right. He hadn't known. He had felt it. He felt the danger before he saw it, before he heard it. The buzzing was an alarm. A painful, debilitating alarm. He crawled back to his desk and opened his notebook to a new page. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the paper. How could he even begin to describe this? He wrote, Section 4, Unidentified Sensory Phenomenon. Description, a painful, high-frequency buzzing sensation originating from the base of the skull. Causes disorientation, nausea, and blurred vision. Seems to be triggered by imminent, localized danger, in this instance, a speeding vehicle. The sensation preceded the visual and auditory confirmation of the threat by approximately 1.5 seconds. It ceased the moment the primary threat, potential impact, was averted. Is this related to the danger sense mentioned on the Auskorptur? If so, it is not a gift. It is an agony. It's uncontrollable. What if it happens in class? Or during a test? How am I supposed to function if my own head is screaming at me? He put the pen down, his mind reeling. Strength he could hide. Agility he could pass off as a fluke. Wall crawling he could keep to the privacy of his own room. But this was a part of him he couldn't control. A blaring siren wired directly into his nervous system. The secret was becoming a monster, growing larger and more complex with every passing hour. He felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. He couldn't tell his mom. She would either think he was crazy or drag him to a hospital, where his secret would surely be discovered. He couldn't tell anyone at school. They would think he was a freak, a liar, or both. He couldn't even tell a doctor. What would he say? I think I was bitten by a radioactive spider and now I have superpowers and a headache. They'd have him committed. He was an anomaly. A walking, talking lab experiment. The thought sent a fresh wave of horror through him. Was he even human anymore? What if the changes weren't finished? What if one day he woke up with 6 arms and a craving for insects? He fell into his bed, pulling the covers over his head as if he could hide from his own altered biology. He had spent 10 long years dreaming of having a quirk, of being special, of being a hero. Now, he had something more powerful than most quirks he had ever seen, and all he felt was the crushing weight of isolation. He had the power, but his dream of being a hero, of standing in the light alongside people like All Might, felt more impossible than ever before. He was no longer just quirkless. He was a secret, and secrets, he was beginning to learn, don't belong in the light. The days that followed Izuku Midoriya's self-discovery were a masterclass in paranoia. He moved through his life like a phantom, his every action governed by a new and terrifying internal calculus. Don't grip the handrail too tightly. Don't close the door too hard. Don't pat your friend on the back. Don't lean against the wall. Don't. His world had transformed into a landscape of fragile objects he could accidentally shatter. His own body felt less like a vessel and more like a barely contained weapon. The anxiety was a constant, simmering presence in his gut. It was a different beast from the familiar, dull ache of being quirkless. That had been a fear of inadequacy, of being left behind. This was a fear of consequence, of what he was capable of. It was the fear of a boy holding a loaded gun for the first time, terrified of the damage it could do if he squeezed the trigger by mistake. Sleep offered little respite. His dreams were vivid, chaotic symphonies of sensation. He dreamt he was clinging to the side of a skyscraper as a gale-force wind tried to tear him loose, his fingers and toes bonded to the glass. He dreamt of labyrinthine webs, their silken strands humming with a million tiny vibrations, feeding him an overwhelming torrent of information about the city below. More than once, he woke up not in his bed, but on his ceiling, his heart pounding in the disorienting darkness. Getting down without waking his mother became a practiced, silent art. He needed an outlet. A safe space where he could push his limits without breaking his entire world. He found it in the one place in Muzurafu that was already broken. Dagoba Municipal Beach Park was less a park and more a monument to civic neglect. For years, illegal dumping had turned its once sandy shores into a metallic mountain range of discarded technology and industrial waste. Rusted cars, gutted refrigerators, twisted steel girders, and mountains of defunct electronics were piled high, their jagged forms silhouetted against the setting sun. The tides had washed years of filth onto the shore, leaving a place so undesirable that no one ever came here. It was perfect. Under the cloak of twilight, Izuku began his real training. It was not the glorious, inspiring montage of a hero preparing for battle. It was the methodical, fearful probing of a scientist studying an unstable element. His first focus was strength. He found a discarded refrigerator, its door ripped from its hinges. He remembered seeing pro heroes lift cars with ease. He crouched, wrapped his arms around the appliance, and lifted. It rose from the sand with such startling lightness that he stumbled backward, nearly throwing the several hundred-pound object over his head. He set it down with a heavy thump, his eyes wide. It had felt as heavy as a cardboard box. He moved on to a solid, rust-pitted steel I-beam half buried in the sand. He gripped it with both hands, planted his feet, and pulled. At first, nothing happened. He gritted his teeth, a frustrated grunt escaping his lips, and pulled harder, pouring more of this strange new energy into his muscles. There was a low, groaning sound of protesting metal. The I-beam, a piece of industrial hardware designed to support the weight of a building, began to bend in his grip. The steel contorted, the rust flaking off like dead skin, until it was curved into a distinct U-shape. Izuku let go, his hands tingling. He stared at the bent beam, his breath catching in his chest. This wasn't just strong. This was monstrous. This was the kind of power that could punch through concrete walls, that could derail a train, that could kill a man with a single, careless blow. The thought made him feel sick. It was during one of these strength tests that something new and bizarre occurred. He was trying to lift one end of a half-submerged, waterlogged car. The weight was immense, pushing him to his absolute limit. His muscles screamed, his knuckles were white, and his entire body was coiled with tension. He focused all his energy into a single, desperate heave. Thwip! A thick, white, rope-like strand of something shot out from the back of his right wrist, arcing through the air and sticking to the side of a pile of discarded televisions 20 feet away with a wet, adhesive splat. Izuku froze, the car forgotten. It dropped back into the sand with a heavy splash. He stared at his wrist, then at the strange, milky white line that connected him to the junk pile. It was coming from him. He wiggled his fingers. The line swayed. He could feel it, an extension of his own body. He gave a tentative tug. It was incredibly strong, taut and unyielding. Curiosity overriding his shock, he held his left hand in front of his face, bent his 2 middle fingers down towards his palm in a strange, instinctive gesture, and flexed his wrist hard. Thwip! A second, similar strand erupted from a tiny pore on the inside of his wrist, this one splattering against a nearby pile of tires. He stared at his hands. There were no visible nozzles or glands. The substance just emerged. He touched the strand connected to his right wrist. It was slick, slightly elastic, and ridiculously sticky. It began to dissolve after a few minutes, breaking down into a fine, biodegradable powder that blew away in the salty air. He spent the next hour in a state of bewildered experimentation. He learned that the substance, which he mentally dubbed webbing, was produced by a combination of mental focus and a specific physical gesture. He could shoot it in a thin, strong line for swinging or a wider, net-like spray for covering an area. It was also, he discovered with a grimace, finite. After a dozen shots, he felt a strange, deep exhaustion, and the production of webbing slowed to a trickle. It was tied to his own biological energy. It was a part of him. He documented it all in his secret notebook, Personal Power Analysis, his diagrams becoming more and more outlandish. Human anatomy charts were now annotated with question marks pointing to his wrists. His strength scaling charts had footnotes about the potential for catastrophic failure. His agility notes were accompanied by frantic sketches of a spider's nervous system. The book was becoming the gospel of his own terrifying transformation. Despite the methodical nature of his training, his anxiety never fully subsided. The painful buzzing of his danger sense was a constant wild card. It would flare up at random moments, a piercing shriek in his mind that sent him diving for cover from a falling piece of scrap metal or a collapsing pile of junk. It saved him from injury countless times, but each activation left him with a splitting headache and jangled nerves. It was a guardian angel that screamed in his ear. His newfound powers were a secret that festered in the darkness. He felt like a walking paradox, more capable than ever, yet more isolated than ever. The desire to be a hero, the very core of his being, still burned within him. But how could he be a hero when he was so afraid of himself? The question haunted him, a constant, nagging whisper in the back of his mind. One evening, that whisper was drowned out by a scream. He was walking home from the library, taking a shortcut through a labyrinth of narrow commercial alleys. The sun had set, and the world had been painted in shades of deep indigo and the artificial orange of streetlights. It was a route he'd walked 100 times, his head down, lost in thought. He was mentally reviewing the structural integrity of Endeavor's costume armor when a shrill cry of terror sliced through the quiet night. It was close. Just around the next corner. Izuku froze, his blood turning to ice. Every rational thought in his head screamed at him. Walk away. This isn't your problem. You're not a hero. You don't have a license. You could hurt someone. You could get caught. But then he heard a man's gruff, threatening voice, and the sound of a struggle. Someone was in trouble. Someone needed help. And Izuku Midoriya, for the first time in his life, could actually do something about it. His heroic instinct, so long suppressed and starved, roared to life. It was a raw, primal force that completely overrode his fear and his logic. Before he could second-guess himself, his body was moving. He pulled the hood of his dark green sweatshirt up over his head, casting his face in shadow. He dug into his pocket and pulled out the plain white medical mask he, like many people, carried out of habit. He hooked it over his ears, obscuring the lower half of his face. It wasn't a costume. It was a desperate, flimsy shield of anonymity. He didn't run around the corner. Instead, he looked up. The brick wall of the adjacent building rose 3 stories into the darkness. Without hesitation, he pressed his hands and feet against the rough surface. That familiar, tingling connection took hold, and he scrambled up the wall with the silent, unnerving speed of a spider. He reached the roof in seconds, his heart hammering against his ribs. He crept to the edge and peered down into the alley below. The scene was sickeningly familiar, a trope played out 1,000 times in the news. A woman, clutching a briefcase, was backed against a graffiti-covered wall. A hulking man in a stained tank top and cargo pants was trying to rip a purse from her shoulder. He had a nasty, jagged scar running down his arm and a cruel sneer on his face. "Just give it to me, lady, and I won't have to get rough," the mugger snarled. "Please, no! My ID, my keys, everything is in there," she pleaded, her voice trembling. Izuku's new senses were on fire. He could smell the stale sweat on the mugger, the cheap perfume the woman was wearing, the rain-soaked concrete of the alley. He could hear the frantic thumping of her heart. The man raised his hand to strike her. That was it. The switch was flipped. There was no more time for thought, no more time for anxiety. There was only the act. He leaped from the roof. He had intended to land gracefully, to use his agility to his advantage. But in his adrenaline-fueled haze he misjudged the drop. He landed on the ground with a solid thump that was louder than he wanted, his knees buckling slightly to absorb the impact. Both the woman and the mugger spun around, their eyes wide with shock. They saw a figure shrouded in darkness, a slim silhouette in a hoodie and a blank white mask. For a split second, none of them moved. The mugger recovered first. A look of contemptuous disbelief crossed his face. "What the hell is this? Some kid playing hero? Get lost before you get hurt." He turned his back on Izuku, dismissing him as a non-threat, and made another grab for the woman's purse. That was his mistake. Izuku saw red. The sheer arrogance of the man, the casual cruelty of his actions, ignited a fire in his chest. He lunged forward, his right hand extended, intending to shove the man away from the woman, to put himself between them. This was the moment where 10 years of hero analysis should have kicked in. He should have remembered Kamui Woods' lectures on minimum force. He should have recalled Death Arms' interviews about calibrating strength based on the threat. He knew, intellectually, all about control, but intellectual knowledge and practical application were 2 very different things. His palm connected with the mugger's back. He had intended it to be a firm push, a glorified shove. But he forgot. He forgot about the refrigerator that felt like cardboard, the I-beam that bent like clay. He put the strength of a normal, angry teenager into the blow. But he was not a normal teenager anymore. The result was explosive. A sickening crack echoed through the alley, a sound like a tree branch snapping in a storm. The mugger was launched forward as if he'd been hit by a car. He didn't just stumble. He flew. He sailed through the air, his body a ragdoll, and slammed into the brick wall on the other side of the alley with a wet, meaty impact that made Izuku's stomach churn. The man slid down the wall, leaving a faint smear on the bricks, and crumpled to the ground in a motionless, broken heap. Silence. The only sound was the distant wail of a siren and the ragged, shallow breaths from Izuku's own lungs. He stared at his hand, then at the unmoving form of the mugger. What have I done? The thought was a shard of ice in his heart. I hit him too hard. Way too hard. Is he dead? Did I just kill him? Panic, absolute and overwhelming, seized him. His vision tunneled. His legs felt weak. He was going to be sick. He wasn't a hero. He was a monster. A killer. The woman he tried to save let out a small, terrified whimper. He had forgotten she was even there. He turned to look at her, a desperate, silent apology forming in his mind. But she wasn't looking at him with gratitude. She was staring at him with the same wide-eyed terror she had shown the mugger. Her gaze flickered from the broken man on the ground to Izuku, the strange, masked figure who had appeared from the shadows and displayed such horrifying, brutal strength. She took a step back, clutching her purse to her chest like a shield. She wasn't looking at a savior. She was looking at the bigger monster. The mugger on the ground groaned, a low, pained sound. He was alive. A wave of dizzying relief washed over Izuku, so potent it almost brought him to his knees. He hadn't killed him, but the man was trying to push himself up, his arm bent at an unnatural angle. He had to restrain him. The police were coming. Adrenaline surged through him again, his instincts taking over. He needed to stop him from getting away. He thought of the webbing, the strange new tool in his arsenal. Without a second thought, he flicked his wrists forward, mimicking the gesture he'd practiced at the beach. The result was not the clean, elegant thread he had envisioned. It was a messy, panic spray. Thick, goopy ropes of the white substance shot from his wrists, splattering across the lower half of the mugger's body. They instantly adhered to his legs and the surrounding pavement, pinning him to the ground in a sticky, grotesque cocoon. The sight of it was the final straw for the woman. She let out a choked cry, turned, and ran, her footsteps echoing down the alley as she fled from the crime scene, from the mugger, and from her would-be rescuer. Izuku stood alone, the sirens growing louder, the air thick with the smell of ozone and his own failure. He had saved the day. He had stopped the crime, but he had terrorized the victim, nearly killed the perpetrator, and revealed a bizarre, monstrous power to the world. He was sloppy. He was dangerous. He was uncontrolled. The wail of the sirens was a physical goad. He had to get out of there. He launched himself back at the wall, his hands and feet finding purchase, and scrambled towards the rooftops. As he crested the edge of the building, he glanced down one last time. The first police car was just arriving. The officers would find a badly injured man stuck to the ground with a substance they couldn't possibly identify. He ran, leaping from rooftop to rooftop, his powerful legs carrying him across the gaps with terrifying ease. He didn't stop until he was miles away, his lungs burning, his mind a maelstrom of self-recrimination. He finally collapsed on the roof of a derelict apartment building, his back against the water tower, and looked out over the glittering expanse of the city. The flashing red and blue lights from the alley were a tiny, insignificant speck in the vast urban sprawl, but for Izuku, they were a beacon of his own monumental failure. He pulled off his mask and hood, gasping in the cool night air. He replayed the entire incident in his mind, his analytical brain dissecting it with brutal, merciless precision. Error 1. Lack of situational assessment. Acted on pure impulse. Error 2. Uncontrolled application of force. Resulted in excessive injury to the perpetrator. Potential for fatality was dangerously high. Error 3. Unrefined use of biological agent, webbing. Application was messy and visually alarming. Error 4. Failure to reassure or secure the civilian. Subject's presence and actions induced further fear and distress. Conclusion. Mission was a catastrophic failure on a strategic and ethical level. He buried his face in his hands, a dry, choked sob escaping his lips. He was so stupid. So arrogant. He thought because he had power, because he had studied heroes his whole life, that he could just jump in and be one. He thought of All Might. When All Might saved someone, he did it with a booming laugh and an indomitable smile. He controlled his godlike power with such precision that he could stop a speeding truck without cracking the pavement. He reassured civilians, his very presence a balm on their fear. He was the total package, power, skill, and heart. Izuku had the power. He had the heart. But he had none of the skill. And that, he realized with a sudden, painful clarity, was the entire point. Power wasn't a gift you were given. It was an instrument you had to learn to play. Having a grand piano didn't make you a concert pianist. Having superhuman strength didn't make you a hero. For years, he had cursed his quirkless fate. He had believed that the only thing holding him back was a lack of power. He was wrong. Power was just the first, most dangerous step. With great power, he thought, the phrase echoing from some half-remembered pre-Quirk comic book, comes great responsibility. But it wasn't just a responsibility to use his powers for good. It was a responsibility to understand them, to control them, to master them. It was the responsibility to ensure that his attempts to help didn't cause more harm. It was the responsibility to be better than he was tonight. He sat there for a long time, the city's hum a quiet companion to his thoughts. The initial wave of panic and self-loathing slowly receded, replaced by something colder, harder, and far more useful, determination. He wouldn't stop. He couldn't. He had seen the fear in that woman's eyes, and he knew that there were countless others out there who felt that same fear every day. He had the ability to protect them, to hide that ability away, to let it atrophy out of fear of his own incompetence, felt like the ultimate act of cowardice. But he wouldn't be that reckless, impulsive kid in the alley ever again. He went home, slipped silently into his room, and took out a brand new notebook. He didn't write hero analysis for the future on the cover. He wrote, Project Spider, Power Control Combat Application. Volume 1. He opened it to the first page and began to write, his handwriting neat and precise. He would approach this not as a fanboy, but as a scientist. He would break down every aspect of his new physiology and build a new fighting style from the ground up, one that prioritized control, efficiency, and non-lethal force. He designed a series of drills, strength calibration exercises, starting with crushing soda cans and working his way up, learning to feel the exact point of structural failure in an object. Agility courses to be run at Dagoba, focusing on fluid movement and environmental awareness. Webbing target practice, creating specific shapes and patterns, learning to control the aperture of the spinnerets he didn't even know he had. He would study the pros again, but with a new eye. He would analyze Eraserhead's use of capture weapons for non-violent takedowns. He would deconstruct Ryukyu's ability to manage her immense size in crowded urban environments. He would watch every video he could find of All Might, not for the spectacle of his Detroit smashes, but for the moments in between. The way he braced a falling building just enough to hold it steady. The way he scooped up civilians without giving them whiplash. The anxiety was still there, a cold knot in his stomach. But it was no longer a paralyzing fear. It was a catalyst. It was a reminder of the stakes. He had seen the razor-thin line between hero and menace, and he had stumbled right over it. He would spend every waking moment ensuring it never happened again. He looked at his reflection in the dark window. The same freckled, anxious face looked back. But something had changed. The desperate hope in his eyes had been forged into a grim, unyielding resolve. His journey to becoming a hero hadn't started with a dream, or a power. It started here, in the quiet of his room, with the humbling, terrifying knowledge of his own fallibility. It started with a promise to be better. The organic webbing was a miracle of biology. Izuku Midoriya, in his most objective, analytical moments, had to admit that. It was a fluid protein chain, produced within his own forearms, that solidified upon contact with the air into a substance with a tensile strength that defied all known materials science. It was strong enough to support his body weight, adhesive enough to stick to any surface, and it dissolved into a harmless, inert powder after about an hour, leaving no evidence behind. As a biological tool, it was perfect. As a practical tool for an aspiring vigilante, it was a logistical nightmare. The problem, he discovered after a week of grueling, clandestine training at Dagoba Beach, was twofold. The first was production. The webbing was intrinsically tied to his metabolism. Creating it required a massive caloric intake. He found himself constantly, ravenously hungry. He was eating more than double his usual amount, yet he felt perpetually drained. After a night of practicing swings and restraining techniques, webbing up old washing machines and rusted-out car doors, he would return home feeling a deep, cellular exhaustion that left him dizzy and weak. His body was a factory, and the webbing was its most expensive, energy-intensive product. He couldn't afford to mass-produce it. The second, more pressing problem was volume. He simply couldn't make enough of it, fast enough. During a simulated high-stress scenario, pretending a teetering pile of scrap metal was a collapsing building, he ran out of webbing after a few dozen rapid-fire shots. He was left with a faint, sputtering mist and a profound sense of helplessness. In a real crisis, facing multiple threats or needing to create a large safety net, he would be useless. His greatest asset had a cripplingly small magazine size. He sat one evening on a pile of discarded tires, the salty wind whipping through his hair, and stared at his wrists in frustration. The problem seemed insurmountable. He couldn't change his own biology. He couldn't just will his body to be more efficient. His mind, as it often did when faced with a complex problem, began to race through his memories, searching for relevant data. It sifted through years of hero analysis, through countless science articles, through every textbook he'd ever read. And then, it landed on a specific moment. A memory from the Oscorp tour. It wasn't the spiders, or the labs, or the sleek corporate lobby. It was a voice. A quiet, intelligent voice cutting through the canned presentation of the tour guide. But wouldn't a synthesized polymer based on a lysine-rich polypeptide sequence offer greater elasticity without sacrificing tensile strength? You could theoretically create a fluid that remains stable in a pressurized cartridge but solidifies through rapid shear thinning upon extrusion. The tour guide had blinked, momentarily stunned by the complexity of the question from a 14-year-old kid. Izuku, however, had been electrified. He had turned to see who had spoken. It was the quiet boy with the messy brown hair and the old camera. The one from Midtown High. The one who had answered that impossible quantum mechanics question. Peter Parker. The memory was a key turning in a lock. Peter hadn't just been asking a question, he had been proposing a solution. A synthetic alternative. A way to replicate the properties of spider silk. At the time, Izuku had mentally filed it away as a brilliant piece of theoretical science. Now, it was the most important idea in the world. A frantic hope surged through him. Could it be done? Could he create an artificial web fluid? And more importantly, how would he even deploy it? The idea of wrist-mounted devices, something out of a comic book, bloomed in his mind. But the science, the engineering, the chemistry, it was all light years beyond his high school curriculum. He was a brilliant analyst, but he wasn't an inventor. But Peter Parker might be. The idea was insane. Contacting a boy he'd met for all of 5 minutes, an ocean away, to ask for help building superhero gadgets based on a secret he couldn't possibly reveal? It was absurd. It was desperate. It was his only option. The first challenge was finding him. Izuku didn't even know his last name for sure. He just had a first name, Peter, and a school, Midtown High. He spent hours on the school's public-facing website, scanning through articles and photo galleries from their science fairs and academic decathlon teams. Finally, he found him. A grainy photo of the Midtown Academic Decathlon team, holding a first-place trophy. And there he was, second from the left, a sheepish, proud smile on his face. The caption read, "Team Captain Peter Parker credited with the win." Now he had a name. The next step was making contact without revealing his own identity. He couldn't just email him as Izuku Midoriya. He created a new, anonymous email address and a burner account on a popular international science forum, a place where university students and amateur engineers discussed everything from rocketry to molecular gastronomy. He chose a username that felt both descriptive and safely generic, analysis_hero. He lurked on the forums for days, learning the etiquette, before he found his opening. A thread titled, "Biomimicry in Materials Science." It was a perfect fit. He found a post by a user named ScienceGuy_NYC, whose profile picture was a low-res image of Albert Einstein sticking his tongue out. The user was passionately debating the viability of creating synthetic muscle fibers based on shark cartilage. His arguments were sharp, witty, and backed by an encyclopedic knowledge of biology and physics. A quick search of his post history confirmed it. The writing style, the specific scientific interests, the New York-based slang that peppered his posts, it had to be Peter. Izuku's heart hammered in his chest. This was it. He took a deep breath and began to type, composing his message with the meticulous care of a diplomat drafting a treaty. He couldn't ask for help directly. He had to frame it as a theoretical exercise, a thought experiment between two like-minded science enthusiasts. To ScienceGuy_NYC, from Analysis_Hero, subject, biomimicry, a question on polymer chains. Hello ScienceGuy_NYC, I've been following your posts on the biomimicry thread and I'm incredibly impressed with your insights, particularly regarding protein synthesis. It's a field I'm also deeply interested in. I have a hypothetical question I was hoping you might have some thoughts on. Theoretically, imagine you wanted to create a synthetic adhesive fluid with properties similar to arachnid silk, specifically, the dragline silk of an Araneus diadematus. The goal would be extreme tensile strength, comparable to steel on a weight-to-strength ratio, high elasticity, and biodegradability. You also mentioned shear-thinning polymers in a previous post, which I found fascinating. My question is this. Theoretically, How could one design a chemical formula for such a fluid that would allow it to be stored in a liquid state under pressure, but would solidify almost instantly upon release into normal atmospheric conditions? What would be the primary chemical components? And what kind of delivery mechanism would you envision for deploying such a fluid in, say, a thin, controllable strand? This is purely a thought experiment, of course. A personal project to stretch the old gray matter. Any insights you have would be greatly appreciated. Your understanding of this stuff is on another level. Best, analysis_hero. He read it over a dozen times, his finger hovering over the send button. It felt like stepping off a cliff. He was inviting a complete stranger into the most guarded secret of his life, even if that stranger didn't know it. He clicked send. The message vanished into the digital ether, on its way to a bedroom in Queens, New York. For 2 days, there was nothing. Izuku checked his inbox every 10 minutes, a knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach with each refresh. Maybe Peter thought he was a weirdo. Maybe he was too busy. Maybe he just wasn't interested. The hope that had burned so brightly began to flicker. Then, on the 3rd day, a notification popped up. One new message from ScienceGuy_NYC. Izuku's breath hitched. He clicked it open, his eyes scanning the text with feverish intensity. To analysis_hero. From ScienceGuy_NYC. Subject, biomimicry, a question on polymer chains. Analysis_hero. Dude, yes. This is the kind of question I live for. A thought experiment? This is way better than my homework on the socio-economic impact of the Peloponnesian War. Spoiler. It was not great for the Spartans. Okay, so your arachnid silk problem. It's a classic. Oscorp has been throwing billions at it for years. But they're thinking like a corporation. They want something stable and patentable. Let's think like garage tinkerers. It's more fun that way. Shear thinning is absolutely the way to go. You need a non-Newtonian fluid. The key is a long-chain polymer suspended in a solvent that evaporates almost instantly on contact with air. I'm thinking a cocktail of nylon-like polyamides, with some potassium and carbon supplements for strength and adhesion. You could use a simple carbon dioxide cartridge for pressurization, like in a seltzer bottle or a paintball gun. The instant solidification is the tricky part. You'd need the fluid to be forced through a nozzle with an electrostatic spinneret. The charge would align the polymer chains on a molecular level as they exit, turning them from a goopy mess into a cohesive, solid line. It's the same principle as electrospinning nanofibers, just on a macro scale. As for a delivery mechanism? Wrist-mounted is the obvious choice for portability and aiming. A high-pressure release valve, a turbine impeller to regulate flow, and the spinneret nozzle. You could build a prototype housing out of a modified watch casing and some aluminum parts. I got so carried away I sketched something up. Don't laugh, it's just a rough concept. Attachment, web_shooter_v1_concept.jpg. Let me know what you think. This is the most fun I've had with theoretical science all week, Peter. Izuku stared at the screen, his jaw hanging open. It wasn't just a reply. It was an explosion of enthusiastic, infectious genius. Peter hadn't just understood the question. He had solved it, improved upon it, and designed the hardware for it. Izuku clicked the attachment. It was a scanned image of a hand-drawn schematic, sketched on graph paper. It was a detailed, complex design for a wrist-mounted device, complete with annotations for the CO2 cartridge housing, the trigger mechanism, a double-tapped palm switch, and the adjustable spinneret nozzle. It was beautiful. A giddy, disbelieving laugh bubbled up in Izuku's chest. This was it. This was real. He typed back immediately, his fingers flying across the keyboard, his earlier caution replaced by a surge of shared excitement. To ScienceGuy_NYC. From analysis_hero. Peter, this is incredible. It's beyond anything I could have imagined. The electrostatic spinneret is a genius solution to the solidification problem, and the double-tap trigger would prevent accidental discharge. You've thought of everything. I have a few follow-up questions, if you don't mind. For the fluid itself, what kind of ratios would you suggest for the primary components? And what would be the best way to synthesize the base polymer without access to a full industrial lab? This was the beginning of a remarkable correspondence. Their emails flew back and forth across the globe, a rapid-fire exchange of ideas, equations, and schematics. They were two brilliant, lonely minds who had finally found a peer, a kindred spirit who spoke their language. Peter, freed from the constraints of a school curriculum, let his imagination run wild. He sent Izuku complex chemical formulas scribbled on napkins, detailed CD designs for the shooter's internal mechanisms, and links to obscure scientific papers on fluid dynamics. He was an endless fountain of ingenuity. Izuku, for his part, was the perfect partner. He was the analyst to Peter's inventor. He would take Peter's raw, brilliant concepts and refine them, pointing out potential flaws and suggesting improvements. The CO2 cartridge is great for pressure, Izuku wrote. But the rapid depressurization will cause it to freeze. We need to add a small, self-regulating heating element near the valve to prevent the lines from icing over. You're right! Peter would write back hours later. Totally missed that. A simple thermoelectric module powered by a watch battery should do the trick. Man, you're good. It's like you've actually built one of these before. Izuku's heart would skip a beat at comments like that, a cold sweat breaking out on his brow. He was walking a tightrope, and the fall was a long way down. He kept the conversation strictly theoretical, always framing his questions with phrases like, hypothetically, or, if one were to build this. They talked about more than just science. They discovered a shared love for pre-Quark-era comic books, debating whether Captain America could beat Batman in a fight. They lamented their shared status as social outcasts at school, finding solace in the fact that they weren't the only ones who preferred a good book to a loud party. Peter told him about his Aunt May and his Uncle Ben, about his passion for photography, and about his struggles to balance his advanced studies with his non-existent social life. Izuku, in turn, spoke of his admiration for All Might, his passion for hero analysis, which he framed as a strategic hobby, like chess, and the pressures of the Japanese school system. He never mentioned his quirklessness. He never mentioned Bakugo. He never mentioned the bullying. And he certainly never mentioned that he was climbing walls and bending steel in his spare time. Their friendship was built on a foundation of shared intellect and mutual respect, but it was a friendship that, on Izuku's end, was shrouded in a fog of necessary lies. The guilt was a constant companion, but the thrill of having a real friend, someone who saw him as a brilliant peer and not as useless Deku, was too precious to risk. After weeks of digital collaboration, Izuku had what he needed. He had a complete, detailed blueprint for a pair of web shooters and a multi-step formula for a web fluid that, at least on paper, should work. Now came the hard part, turning theory into reality. His laboratory was Dagoba Beach. His funding was his meager allowance, and whatever change he could find in the couch cushions. His raw materials were the mountains of technological refuse that surrounded him. It was a daunting task, but for the first time, Izuku felt a surge of genuine, unadulterated confidence. He wasn't just a powerless fanboy anymore. He was an engineer. He was a builder. He started with the fluid. He needed a place to mix chemicals without stinking up his mother's kitchen or creating a toxic cloud. He found a relatively intact, hollowed-out delivery van half buried in the sand, its back doors rusted shut. Using his enhanced strength, he pried the doors open with a deafening screech of tortured metal. The inside was empty and surprisingly dry. It became his secret workshop. He spent his weekends scavenging. He sourced potassium from discarded batteries. He carefully extracted carbon from old water filters. He found beakers and test tubes in a box of abandoned high school chemistry equipment. The most difficult component was the base polymer. Following Peter's instructions, he needed to synthesize it from a series of common household chemicals that, when combined and heated in the right sequence, would create the long-chain polyamide he needed. The process was a series of comical and terrifying failures. His first batch of fluid had the consistency of watery milk and smelled vaguely of burned hair. His second attempt solidified into a useless, rock-hard brick inside the beaker. The third batch was so sticky it permanently bonded a stirring rod to the bottom of a flask. On his fourth try, he miscalculated the reaction temperature and created a thick, green foam that rapidly expanded out of the beaker and all over the floor of the van, like a scene from a mad scientist's lab. He nearly gave up a dozen times. But then he would reread Peter's enthusiastic emails, his clear, concise instructions, and find the resolve to try again. Peter believed it was possible, and his belief became Izuku's. Finally, on the 7th attempt, he got it right. He mixed the components, carefully monitored the temperature, and produced a small beaker of a pearlescent, viscous liquid. It looked right. It smelled neutral. He dipped a toothpick in and pulled it out. A long, thin, incredibly strong strand followed it. He touched it. It was perfect. He let out a whoop of pure joy, his voice echoing in the confines of the van. He had done it. He had made web fluid. He carefully decanted it into a series of refilled, modified CO2 cartridges he had salvaged from old soda machines. The shooters were an even greater challenge. They required precision. He didn't have a machine shop or a 3D printer. He had a rusty toolbox he found in a dumpster, and his own 2 hands. He filed down pieces of scrap aluminum to create the casings. He painstakingly wound the copper wire for the thermoelectric modules. He used the focusing lens from a broken camera to help him solder the tiny components of the trigger mechanism onto a circuit board he'd pulled from a child's toy. His fingers were constantly sliced and burned. He short-circuited more than one board, filling his van with the acrid smell of burnt electronics. His first prototype was bulky, uncomfortable, and leaked pressurized air. His second version's trigger was so sensitive it fired a cartridge of precious web fluid across the beach when he accidentally bumped it. But with each failure he learned. He refined the design, making it smaller, stronger, more efficient. He was no longer just following Peter's schematics. He was innovating, adapting the design to the materials he had available. He was becoming an inventor in his own right. After nearly a month of tireless work, he had them. 2 sleek, wrist-mounted devices, fashioned from polished aluminum and salvaged parts. They were compact enough to fit under the sleeve of his school uniform, with comfortable, adjustable straps. They weren't perfect, but they were his. The moment of truth arrived on a moonless night. He stood on a high dune at Dagoba, overlooking the dark, churning ocean. He took a deep breath, the salty air filling his lungs. He had a web cartridge loaded into his right shooter. He raised his arm, aimed at a tall, rusted pole that stuck out of the sand about 30 yards away, and pressed his palm with the specific double-tap motion. FFFFFPTHWP. The sound was a satisfying combination of compressed air and a sharp, snapping release. A perfect, white line shot from his wrist, unspooling through the air and impacting the pole with a solid splat. It held. He stared at it, a line of impossible science cutting through the darkness, connecting him to his target. He gave it a tug. It was as strong as steel. A grin, wide and uncontrollable, spread across his face. It was a grin of triumph, of relief, of pure, unadulterated joy. He had done it. He and Peter, 2 nerds, an ocean apart, had built the impossible in their spare time. He felt an overwhelming surge of gratitude for his friend in Queens. He owed him everything. He typed out a quick email on his phone, to ScienceGuy_NYC, from Analysis_Hero. Peter, I think I've solved it. The final piece of the puzzle for our thought experiment. The fluid is stable. The delivery system is functional. It's all theoretical, of course. But on paper, it's perfect. I couldn't have done it without you. Thank you. He hit send and looked back at the web line. Now came the final, terrifying test. He took a running start, leaped off the dune, and for the first time, trusted his life not to his strange, new biology, but to his own mind, his own hands, and the genius of a friend he had never truly met. The world dissolved into a terrifying, exhilarating blur of motion. For a single, heart-stopping second after Izuku leaped from the dune, there was only the cold, empty air beneath him and the roar of the ocean in his ears. Gravity, the one constant in his old life, reasserted its dominance with a vengeance, pulling him down towards the hard, junk-strewn sand. His stomach plummeted. His life was now literally hanging by a thread of his own creation. He instinctively tightened his grip on the web line, his knuckles white. The line went taut with a sharp twang, the sound vibrating up his arm. The sudden deceleration was brutal, wrenching his shoulder in its socket with a fiery jolt of pain. He grunted, his teeth clenched, as his body swung in a wide, pendulous arc. He was flying. Or not flying, but the closest a human being could come. The wind screamed past his ears. The dark landscape of Dagobah Beach became a streaking watercolor of rust and shadow below him. He was a stone in a sling, propelled forward by the raw, kinetic energy of his own momentum. It was clumsy, painful, and utterly, breathtakingly glorious. As his arc reached its zenith and he began to swing back towards the ground, panic flared. He hadn't thought this far ahead. His meticulously analytical brain, for once, had been silenced by pure, impulsive joy. He was going to slam into the side of a junk pile. Let go! His mind screamed. He released the web line. He was airborne again, but this time with a purpose. He spotted his next anchor point, the skeletal frame of a burn-up bus, and fired his left shooter. FFFFFTHWP. The new line connected. He grabbed it, the timing less than perfect, and was yanked sideways, his trajectory shifting violently. He swung around the bus, his feet skimming just inches above a pile of jagged metal. He was learning, adapting, his hyperreflexes and accelerated mind processing the complex physics of the swing in real time. He was no longer just a passenger on this wild ride. He was the pilot. He spent the next hour like a child with the world's most dangerous new toy. He swung through the metallic canyons of Dagobah, his initial terror slowly giving way to a burgeoning confidence. He learned to control the length of his lines, to use his momentum to gain height, to chain his swings together in a fluid, continuous motion. He botched landings, tumbling into heaps of sand and scrap, his body already peppered with bruises. He misjudged distances, firing webs that fell short or overshot their mark. But with every mistake, he got better. The pain in his shoulder eventually subsided to a dull ache, overshadowed by the sheer, unadulterated freedom of it all. This was a power born not from a radioactive spider bite, but from his own intellect, his own perseverance, and the help of a friend. It felt earned. It felt his. As he finally came to a stop, his chest heaving and his body buzzing with adrenaline, he knew he had crossed a threshold. With these shooters, he could patrol, he could pursue, he could save people in ways he couldn't before. He could be more than just a strong guy who stuck to walls. He could be a true hero. But heroes needed an identity. His first disastrous outing in the hoodie and medical mask had taught him that much. The anonymity it provided was flimsy, but more importantly, it was terrifying to civilians. It was the look of a thug, a villain. He needed a symbol. Something that would tell people, in a single glance, that he was on their side. He needed a costume. The project consumed him. It became an obsession that eclipsed even the shooters. His bedroom transformed into a secret workshop, littered with sketches, fabric swatches, and discarded prototypes. He couldn't just buy a hero costume. They were custom-made, expensive, and required a quirk registration that he didn't have. He would have to build this symbol with his own two hands. His first design was a direct, almost shameless homage to his idol, All Might. He sketched a suit with bold primary colors, a flowing cape, and two long, antenna-like tufts that mimicked All Might's iconic hair. He showed the sketch to his mother, framing it as a design for a school art project. Inko Midoriya had looked at it, her head tilted. "Oh, Izuku, it's very heroic," she'd said in that gentle, diplomatic way of hers. "But are you sure? It looks a little loud. Maybe something that's more you." She was right. He wasn't All Might. He was something different. His powers were different. His methods would have to be different. He couldn't be a daylight brawler, a shining symbol of overwhelming power. He was a creature of the shadows, of agility and stealth. His suit needed to reflect that. He went back to the drawing board, this time taking inspiration from his own namesake. Spiders were silent hunters, masters of ambush and acrobatics. His costume needed to be sleek, functional, and non-restrictive. His base was a dark green, full-body tracksuit he ordered online, the kind favored by parkour enthusiasts. It was made of a durable, four-way stretch fabric that wouldn't tear or bunch up during his acrobatics. The color was a deep, forest green, a nod to his own name, but also practical for moving through the city's shadows. Next came the armor. He knew he couldn't afford advanced polymer plating like the pros used. He needed something cheap, lightweight, and effective at absorbing impact. His solution came, as it so often did, from the scrap heaps of Dagobah. He found a crate of discarded sporting equipment, including a set of high-impact motocross pads. He spent hours carefully cutting and reshaping the hard plastic plates, using a heat gun to mold them to the contours of his own body. He covered them in a tough, crimson-red canvas fabric he bought from a craft store, the color a stark, heroic contrast to the dark green of the suit. He stitched the plates onto the tracksuit, reinforcing the chest, shoulders, and shins. It was crude, but it would protect him from stray bullets or a clumsy landing. His boots were his old, favorite pair of red high tops. They were comfortable, broken in, and had excellent grip. He reinforced the soles with layers of vulcanized rubber he stripped from discarded tires, giving him extra shock absorption and durability. They were still recognizably sneakers, a subtle reminder that underneath it all, he was just a kid. The mask was the most critical component. It had to hide his face completely, without obscuring his vision or muffling his breathing. His first attempt, a simple ski mask, was hot and claustrophobic. His second, a more complex sewn hood, limited his peripheral vision. He finally settled on a full-face spandex mask, separate from the suit, that zipped up the back. The eyes were the real challenge. He needed lenses that would protect his eyes from wind and debris while swinging, but wouldn't fog up or shatter. He found his answer in a pair of old, cracked welding goggles. He carefully removed the thick, tinted lenses and replaced them with curved, shatterproof polycarbonate heat salvaged from a broken bus stop shelter. He painstakingly polished them, then framed them with a thick, white plastic border he cut from a bleach bottle. The result was two large, expressive, spider-like white eyes. They gave the blank face of the mask a semblance of personality, wide and almost friendly, a stark contrast to the intimidating scowls of heroes like Endeavor. They were designed to be approachable. He stitched the whole thing together on his mother's old sewing machine, his fingers clumsy at first, but growing more adept with each pass. The seams were uneven, the stitching a little crooked in places. It was clearly, undeniably homemade. But when he finally put it all on, standing in front of the full-length mirror on his closet door, he saw something new. He didn't see a Zucca, the quirkless, anxious teenager. He saw a hero. A strange, arachnid-themed figure, clad in green and red, his face a blank white-eyed mask. He was slim, agile, and exuded an aura of quiet competence. The suit wasn't just a disguise, it was a transformation. It was the skin he would wear to become someone else. Someone better. With his arsenal and his identity taking shape, one final piece of the puzzle remained, a name. Spider-Man was the obvious choice, a direct translation of his powers. But it felt foreign. It was the name of a pre-quirk comic book hero, an American icon. He was operating in Japan. He needed a name that would resonate here, that would feel like it belonged to the streets of Muzurifu. He filled pages of his notebook with possibilities. Arachnid Knight. The Wallcrawler. Spinneret. They all sounded clunky, derivative, or just plain silly. He thought about using his own name, Deku. It was a name Bakugo had given him to mean useless, but a friend in middle school, Achiko Uraraka, had once told him it sounded like Dikairu, the word for you can do it. He had always held on to that, the idea of reclaiming a name meant to hurt him and turning it into a symbol of inspiration. But it felt too personal. To use it would be to tie his heroic identity too closely to his civilian one. The risk was too great. He was researching Japanese folklore for inspiration when he stumbled upon the legend of the Joragumo, a spider demon that could shape-shift into a beautiful woman. The name was too villainous, but the root word Kumo was simple, direct, and elegant. It meant simply spider. It was perfect. It was understated. It hinted at his powers without being ostentatious. It was a name the press could latch onto, a name that could be whispered in back alleys. It was the name of a mystery, a shadow, not a celebrity. Kumo. The night he chose to debut his new identity was cold and clear. The city spread out beneath him, a glittering tapestry of light and shadow. He stood on the edge of a skyscraper, the wind whipping at his new costume. The suit felt like a second skin. The web shooters were strapped securely to his wrists, loaded with fresh cartridges of his own design. He was no longer the frightened, impulsive boy in a hoodie. He was Kumo. He took a running start and leaped from the edge of the building, a silent, green and red figure plummeting towards the street below. He waited, letting himself fall, feeling the rush of wind, the dizzying drop. At the last possible second, he fired a web line. FFFFFTHWP. It connected to the cornice of a neighboring building, and his fall transitioned into a perfect, breathtaking swing. This time, there was no wrenching pain in his shoulder, no clumsy scrambling. He moved with a newfound grace, his body and his tools working in perfect harmony. He let go, fired another line, and chained the swings together, a silent acrobat dancing through the concrete and steel jungle. It was in this moment, soaring between the skyscrapers of Muzutafu, that he finally felt it. Not fear, not anxiety, not the weight of his secret, but pure, unadulterated joy. He was doing it. He was living the dream he had held onto for a decade. He was free. He finally felt, in every fiber of his being, like a hero. For the next several weeks, Kumo became Muzutafu's ghost story. He was a whisper among criminals, a blurry photograph in the tabloids, a myth taking shape in the city's underbelly. He operated with a precision and caution that was the polar opposite of his first disastrous outing. He would spend hours perched on rooftops, his enhanced senses feeding him the rhythm of the city. He would listen to police scanners through a cheap, modified radio, picking up on crimes that the big-name heroes were too busy to handle. He focused on the small things, the purse snatchings, the back-alley muggings, the break-ins. The crimes that slipped through the cracks. His methods were brutally efficient and surprisingly gentle. He would descend from the shadows, a silent, unnerving presence. He would disarm and incapacitate criminals using a combination of his agility, his strength, now carefully calibrated, and his webs. He never threw a punch if he could avoid it. Instead, he would use his webs to gum up their weapons, to pin their feet to the pavement, to wrap them up in neat, easy-to-handle cocoons for the police. He would often be gone before the victims even had a chance to thank him, leaving the criminals webbed to a lamppost with a small, handwritten note that simply said, "A gift from your friendly neighborhood Kumo." The press, initially dismissive, began to take notice. They didn't know what to make of him. Was he a new hero with a stealth quirk? A vigilante? A prankster? His appearances were so brief, his movements so fast, that no one could get a clear picture of him. He was a fleeting glimpse of green and red, a flash of white eyes in the darkness. His existence became a point of contention among the pro-heroes. The more traditional, limelight-loving heroes dismissed him as a dangerous amateur seeking attention. But others, the more pragmatic underground heroes who operated in the same shadowy world, were grudgingly impressed. One of these was Shota Aizawa, the pro-hero known as Eraserhead. Aizawa was on a routine patrol in his designated sector, a grimy, low-rent district known for its high concentration of petty crime, when he first encountered the new vigilante. He was perched on a fire escape, his capture weapon draped around his shoulders, his tired eyes scanning the streets below, when he heard a faint thwip sound from the alley across the street. He melted into the shadows, his movements silent and practiced, and peered into the alley. He saw two thugs attempting to pry open the back door of a pawn shop. Before he could intervene, a figure dropped from the rooftops, landing silently on the dumpster behind them. It was Kumo. Aizawa froze, his curiosity overriding his instinct to engage. He wanted to observe. The figure was small, wiry, and moved with an eerie, insect-like fluidity. He watched as Kumo fired two precise shots of some white, cord-like substance, pinning the crowbar to the wall and binding one of the thug's feet to the ground. The second thug charged, swinging a wild punch. Kumo didn't even seem to try. He simply bent backward, the punch grazing the air where his chest had been, and tapped the man on the shoulder as he stumbled past. Aizawa saw a flicker of movement, and suddenly the second thug was also encased from the waist down in the strange white substance, stuck fast to his accomplice. The whole encounter had taken less than 5 seconds. It was clean, quiet, and utterly effective. Kumo then placed a hand on the pawn shop's back door, and with a soft crunch, appeared to reinforce the lock he had just broken. A final thwip echoed in the alley, and a web line shot upwards. The figure was yanked into the darkness of the rooftops and was gone. Aizawa was left staring into the empty alley, a rare look of stunned contemplation on his weary face. The vigilante's movements were not just acrobatic, they were unnatural. His quirk, erasure, was useless if he couldn't get a clear line of sight on the user. This Kumo was fast, efficient, and clearly skilled. But he was also unregistered, unlicensed, and operating outside the law. He was a problem. Aizawa made a mental note: investigate the new vigilante Kumo. Quirk appears to be some kind of adhesion/projectile combo. High mobility. Underground hero potential, but currently a menace. He would have to shut him down. Izuku, blissfully unaware that he had just become a target for one of the city's most formidable underground heroes, was also starting to attract a different kind of attention. He was in his room, meticulously cleaning his web shooters, when he heard a tremendous explosion from several blocks away. It was followed by the sound of screaming and the distant, familiar roar of a villain on a rampage. He peeked out his window. A thick plume of black smoke was rising into the afternoon sky. It was close to his school. His heart leaped into his throat. He couldn't just sit here. He grabbed his costume, his mind racing. Change on a roof. Approach from the south to avoid the main crowds. Assess the situation before engaging. His training was becoming second nature. He arrived on the scene to chaos. The sludge villain, a grotesque creature of living sewage, had taken a hostage. And the hostage, to Izuku's absolute horror, was Bakugo. He watched from a rooftop, his blood running cold, as the pro-heroes stood by, helpless. Death arms couldn't get a grip on the fluid villain. Kamui Woods was useless in the face of the raging fires the villain had started. Bakugo was thrashing, suffocating, his own powerful explosions only making the situation worse. Izuku's every instinct screamed at him to jump in. He had the power to save him. He could swing in, grab Bakugo, and be out before the villain even knew what was happening. His hand tightened into a fist, but then, something held him back. It was the memory of that first night, of the woman's terrified eyes. The memory of his own catastrophic failure. The pro-heroes were here. This was their jurisdiction. If he, an unknown, unlicensed vigilante, jumped into this high-profile situation, he would cause more chaos. He would be branded a menace, hunted down. He would lose everything he had worked so hard to build. For the first time, his calculated caution warred with his heroic heart. And then, he saw it. A skeletal, gaunt man in a baggy suit running past the police barricades, straight towards the villain. In the blink of an eye, the man transformed. His body swelled with muscle, his face taking on the iconic, smiling visage of the world's greatest hero, All Might. Texas Smash. A single punch. The air pressure alone was enough to obliterate the sludge villain and, miraculously, change the weather, causing it to rain. Bakugo was saved. The crowd roared. All Might stood triumphant, a symbol of absolute victory. Izuku watched, a strange mix of awe and shame churning in his gut. He had hesitated. He had stood by and done nothing while his childhood friend, his tormentor, but still someone he had known his entire life, was about to die. He had made the logical choice, the safe choice, but it felt like the wrong one. Later that day, as he walked home, his mind still reeling, he took a different route, an underpass he rarely used. He was lost in thought when he heard a familiar, booming voice. I am here! All Might landed in front of him in a dramatic superhero pose. Izuku stared, dumbfounded. The hero had somehow followed him. But before Izuku could even stammer out a greeting, All Might deflated like a cheap balloon, transforming back into the skeletal man Izuku had seen earlier, a plume of steam erupting from his body. He coughed, and a trickle of blood ran from the corner of his mouth. The next 10 minutes were the most surreal of Izuku's life. All Might, the symbol of peace, revealed his terrible secret, a grievous, life-threatening injury that severely limited his time as a hero. He explained that he had been impressed by Izuku's heroic spirit, by his instinct to run in and save Bakugo, even though he was quirkless. He had seen the look in Izuku's eyes. It was the look of a true hero. I have been searching for a worthy successor, All Might said, his voice quiet but filled with a steely conviction. And I have chosen you, young man. My quirk is not just any power, it is a sacred torch, passed down from one generation to the next. Its name is one for all. And I am asking you, can you inherit my power? Izuku stood in the shadow of the underpass, the world tilting on its axis. All Might, his idol, the reason he had ever dared to dream, was offering him everything he had ever wanted. A quirk, a chance to be a real, licensed hero. A chance to stand in the light. But he looked down at his own hands, at the wrists where his shooters were cleverly hidden beneath his sleeves. He thought of the suit tucked away in his backpack. He thought of the freedom of swinging through the night sky, of the quiet satisfaction of leaving a criminal webbed up for the police. He thought of his pen pal in Queens. He already had a power. He already had a secret. He was already a hero. Just not the kind the world knew about. All Might, he began, his voice barely a whisper, trembling with the weight of the impossible choice before him. There's something you need to know.